The topic is the Civil Rights Movement in Tennessee, a narrative history, and the guest is Dr. Bobby Lovett, a professor at Tennessee State University, the author of the Civil Rights Movement in Tennessee. Dr. Lovett, let's talk about the Civil Rights Movement in Tennessee, but before we do that, let's sort of give our audience some background kind of information relative to what really prompted the so-called Civil Rights Movement nationally, and then how it impacted Tennessee according to what you have here.
Well, one of the ways I start the book off is explaining to the readers that the African American has always had a civil rights movement since the first ships landed in Jamestown in 1619, that African American slaves were trying to express their freedom however they could, including running away, slave rebellions. And but I say that the civil rights movement really begins in 1865 with the emancipation of the slaves. And African Americans in Tennessee and other places in the South began what I call the first post-slavery civil rights movement. And that movement continued up until about 1881, and it was to do three things: to secure citizenship for the former slaves, of course, to get an amendment so that slavery could never come back, the 13th Amendment, and to get the right to vote. And they accomplished all of those things by 1881, and by 1881 the Jim Crow era started to corrode some of those progressive changes. And from 1881 until about 1930, the second civil rights movement started. And that was basically to try to undo the damage that Jim Crow had done. And so a lot of civil rights organizations will be founded in that period of time. The Afro-American League in 1890, Du Bois's Niagara Movement in 1905, the NAACP will be formed in 1909, the Urban League will be formed in 1910, the Garvey movement in 1920, and so on. And that movement sort of peters out by the early 30s with the coming of the Great Depression. And then in 1935, the civil rights movement that we now talk about really started in 1935-36, when Charles Hamilton Houston, Dean of Law School at Howard University, Harvard Law graduate, was hired by the NAACP to come up with some legal strategies about how to attack Jim Crow. And that ultimately led to a lot of civil rights cases they won. They won 12 or 15 cases in the United States Supreme Court. And the big case they finally won it, and that was Brown versus Board of Education in May of 1954. And that's what started the real public activity, heightened activity of the civil rights movement. And many people equate that period from Brown, 1950s and the 60s, as the civil rights movement. But that was just the culmination of a civil rights movement that African Americans had started in 1865.
And then in a real sense, even earlier, what you said, when they first came and got off the boat, that there was an interest in freedom and civil rights.
That's right.
No matter what you call it, at that particular time,
that's right.
Very good.
The slave rebellions like Denmark Vesey's rebellion in the 18th century, the Coors Nat Turner's rebellion, the Underground Railroad people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and William Lloyd Garrison. We don't really put a label of civil rights leaders on these people, but they were fighting for the same things as civil rights leaders were fighting for in the 1950s and the 1960s, and that's human freedom and human equality under the American Constitution.
Now, the movement in the state of Tennessee, and of course I think we're fortunate in the state of Tennessee, as you know, that we have such a rich history in a real sense with the institutions of higher education, American Baptist College, and etc. Let's talk about how this book fits into that kind of scheme in terms of
well, of course, the book, after giving all of that background, it really concentrates on the period from the 1950s up until the present time, that is up until the book was published 2005. It covers all of those particular years. And it covers the desegregation, of course, of the schools with Brown versus Board of Education across Tennessee. It talks about desegregation of politics. It talks about the desegregation of higher education, including the case a merger of Tennessee State and UT Nashville. And so it tries to comprehensively, in a story, a narrative, cover all those things that were going on between 1955 and 2005 in the state of Tennessee. And most people don't know that Tennessee played an important role in the regional civil rights movement across the South, and that the Freedom Riots really had a great background in Nashville, Tennessee. The sit-ins that were started here spread throughout the South, and they were used as models throughout the nation as here's how you do it through nonviolence. The movement in Memphis was one of the largest and the most protracted civil rights movements in the country. And the civil rights movement spread across into Chattanooga, into Knoxville. There were also great civil rights and sit-in leaders over in those particular states. But Tennessee has not gotten its due in terms of being a leader in the civil rights movement, because most of the movement here did not result in massive violence like it did in Alabama, Little Rock, Arkansas, and so on. Much of the changes in Tennessee were painful, but they were usually nonviolent.
Very good. And you know, Dr. Lovett, I think we're getting ready for our next commercial break. And what we'd like to do for you to do during this last segment that's coming up is to think about the information that you believe that we ought to know out of this book. That is, what are some of the things that you found in terms of your study that almost anything that you have, many of us don't know anything about it, you see, but there are some outstanding kinds of things that I'm sure that you would like to talk about, and that's what we want you to do during the final segment. That is to identify for us those things that are in this book that you say that, well, I bet you didn't know that kind of information, and certainly we certainly would appreciate that. I think we've got about half a minute before we come to an end of this segment, and we don't want to raise any other questions before we do that. But I think that you're giving us essentially what we wanted to have, because as you've indicated earlier, we've talked about the African-American experience during the Civil War and et cetera, but we've missed out on this. That Thurgood, I mean the Houston information and et cetera. We need that. We need to know that. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. The topic is the civil rights.